Hey everyone, I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent Moonshot Podcast. I am excited to welcome my friend Scott Allenby. Scott is the Chief Strategy and Communication Officer at Proctor Academy in Andover, New Hampshire. Scott and I have known each other forever. We've collaborated forever. We've done all sorts of interesting things. And I think one of the things that really always stands out to me when I'm with Scott and working with Scott is that strategy title that he has in his job at Proctor is apropos, right? Like he's just got a very strategic mind and he's expert at communications and communication strategy. Scott and I have been talking on and off for a while now, and with others. Like I've talked to Julie Falstick about this. She's at Stony Brook Strategy about this need to really refine our reactions to crisis communication, right? Like there's always something kind of lingering out there. You never know when it's going to hit, and are you prepared to handle it? And especially from a head's point of view, like are you prepared? Do you have like the right strategic framework in terms of thinking about how to approach crisis comms? So Scott Allenby, my friend, welcome to the podcast.
Peter, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Hey, before we get going, like obviously I know you, right? So you and I don't need to introduce each other, but there are probably people who are listening who would be like, "Who is this Scott Allenby guy?" Like, could you give us a little bit about yourself and Proctor?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been at Proctor Academy for the last 19 years, and Proctor's a multi-gender boarding day school. Around 385 students. We're in kind of central New Hampshire, close by to Peter's alma mater, Brewster Academy.
Yep.
And
fierce rival.
Yeah. So fierce rival. Yes. So my role at the school is I oversee kind of the advancement quadrant of the school. So oversees strategic planning, communications, development, admissions, and serve on the leadership team, and also coach JV basketball. And
that's part of your job.
It's the best part of my job.
Yeah, 100%.
So my wife, Lindsay, and I have been at Proctor for almost our entire careers and have kind of gone through all of the different roles at a school. We've been teachers, coaches, dorm parents, advisors. And I think in my role now, I get to see not only my own kids go through the school, but also get to see kind of the business side of the school and how effective organizations can function and where there's opportunity to help an organization become more effective.
So let's talk about strategy and comms. Some of the best work you can do during a crisis is the work you do before the crisis, right? It's gaining that alignment between key stakeholders. That could be board members, it could be members of the leadership team, it could be members throughout the community. That's a really important thing, I imagine, for a head of school to be cognizant of. But yet it's one of those things where, you've got a million things going on in any given day. Like, is pre-planning for a crisis something that is top of mind when you've got all these other things? Like, I don't know the answer to that. You can talk about it, but how does that all work in your brain? How can you prepare for these things in advance of them happening?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's a great thing to think about. I think none of us really want to think about those crisis moments for a school. And I think you're spot on. It's that pre-work and that pre-relationship building that's so critical. I've been really fortunate to work alongside 3 different heads of school during my time in the communications side. And I think what I've witnessed is that those heads really trusting and bringing me into the conversation, which is so critical to make sure that the team that's going to be messaging out, that's actually responsible for that messaging, is just tied at the hip with the head of school, with the senior leadership team at the school. And I think that's what we're in the midst of an interim head of school right now, year, and then onboarding a new head next year, and future transition board leadership, and all of that. Like, as long as I think we have a cohesive team, and I think it's really critical that the board also has that opportunity to build relationships with the communications folks, so that alignment is not, you're not trying to build those relationships on the fly, because in that crisis moment, and it could be whatever, right? It could be a financial situation, it could be a personnel issue, it could be something tragedy that happens on campus. You want to be able to focus in that moment on the deliverables of how do you take care of the community, and not on, do I trust this person? What's the working relationship with this person next to me? And I'm so fortunate to have worked with heads that prioritize that relationship and have created space for that relationship, both in the day-to-day operations of the school, but also in the board operations of the school.
What does that look like? I'm curious,
Yeah, so for us, I think the day to day is just time spent with each other, and there's quality time, there's just quantity time, just spent in conversation, figuring out who's the voice of the leader and how do you replicate that voice through communications. How do you make sure that that voice feels authentic in a moment of crisis, and it doesn't feel like there's a lawyer behind the scenes that just wrote it, and then we're just sending out the email. I think the board level is a little bit trickier because in most of our schools, the board is a little bit removed from the day-to-day operations of the school, or hopefully is a little bit removed from the day-to-day operations. We've been able to create, we call it an institutional advancement committee within our board structure. That's a standing committee, board, and administrative representation. And so that's created a forum for us to have some conversations in the non-crisis moments about strategy, about messaging, about how do we position ourselves as a school for the future. And some of those conversations are generative and some are very tactical, but I think it's creating that intentional space to have the board voices weigh in alongside the school leadership voices. That's really, really important.
Do you do like intentional exercises before, as part of your leadership team? Hey, let's run this scenario and let's think about how we would react.
We have periodically, but I would say not as much as we should. And I think we've done it more on a macro level with all, like as a whole school tabletop exercise in terms of a crisis that arises, but not necessarily with a smaller group, whether it's the leadership team or the board chair, head of school. I do think that's an opportunity for us to really refine, not just tabletop. Okay, we've got a environmental disaster on campus. How are we going to all respond in our respective departments? But really look at specific scenarios where alignment between leadership, board, communications, messaging is critical.
So you said something earlier about how getting to building the relationship with the head of school, building the relationship with the board, and so when a time of crisis does hit, it sounds the response is genuine, not something that clearly there are going to be legal implications and you're going to have to take counsel and all that sort of stuff. But when you do start the communication process, that it feels like you, right? Versus feeling like something else. How do you make sure that when you're doing that, like what are some steps that you can take when you're doing that to make sure that that messaging both feels genuine but also is like mission centered? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think if we're doing our job well, we zoom back to not just the crisis moment, but to all of our messaging and look at the overall alignment and around mission, around strategic priorities with all of our messaging that's going out. And I think when we are operating at our best, we have really clear alignment between our strategic plan, between whatever the priorities are from a fundraising or enrollment standpoint, from an operational standpoint. And our messaging is really building on top of itself towards whatever those goals are. So I think if you can build that foundation, then I call it like our trust capital that we have to operate with our constituents if we are in a time of crisis or there is something that's come up that's controversial and we need to try to navigate that with our parents, our alumni. So I think it's like over time you build this trust capital as an institution that's really critical, and you don't want to tap into it all the time, but when you do have to tap into it, it's really that long tail of trust that you've built because your communications are so consistent, because they are aligned with your mission. I think the hope is anybody could land on Proctor site or any school site and be like, this is what that school's about, and that messaging is so crystal clear and it's so authentic and it's so in terms of showcasing the full spectrum of a community, not just the shiny, glossy side of it, that you then, if you do enter a situation that's really unfortunate, then you can tap into where we've been telling you the full story all along. We're not just trying to make this one situation go away or look better than it is.
That reminds me. So, like, I'm going to date myself. Back when I had hair and I wasn't wearing glasses, I had interviewed Chuck Will, who, was at Proctor for a long time. I think you followed Chuck, right, in his role.
Yeah.
And Chuck had this amazing blog before there was a blog called Chuck's Corner, and it was highly visual. It was lots of photographs. And I had interviewed him. I probably like the office next to yours right now is on
Yeah.
campus. I
This
remember.
was his office. Yeah.
So I interviewed him right
Yeah.
there. Yeah,
Yeah.
funny. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He's like, "Look, we can't hide from the bad. And like if all we say, all we offer our community is the good, then when something challenging comes about, if it's a crisis or whatnot, then you don't have that capital. Like you need to be vulnerable in certain instances." And I remember he was telling me about, with classic scenario in a boarding school, like the flu kind of spread through campus and people were feeling crummy and all the things. And like they wrote about it, they talked about it. And he said, like, if he just said everything was great on campus, then, there was like people's radars would go off. Right. And am I hearing like what you're saying and then thinking back to Chuck, like, does that align?
Yeah, and I think that's what I've been so fortunate. I've been in this role for the last 11 years, right, since Chuck retired, and so fortunate to step into a community that truly values that, and they're going to call you out if they feel like you're spinning stuff a little bit too aggressively, one way or another. And so that for me is like it's centering in a lot of ways, right? Because it's like, how do we make sure that everything we do is taking care of this community? And it's interesting, Peter, you bring that up. I just hit publish on a blog post or schedule on a blog post. It's going to go out on Friday on, we're just reminding our community and parents that like the diversity of emotion that we experience as individuals is so healthy, and like relating it to the biodiversity of, there's a great Hidden Brain episode that was just podcast episode that just went out talking about this. Like, as humans, how do we make sure that we allow ourselves to experience all of these emotions as individuals, and how do you model that as a community through the messaging? And I think it's spot on.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, Scott, is it's obviously you need to live your mission, right? Like that's critical. Your messaging then scaffolds on top of that, both internally and externally. But, a lot of what you're just talking about in my mind comes down to culture and the culture that you set. Uh, maybe that's before you can get to the place where we're really like dialed in on crisis comms, like thinking about culture. Does that resonate? I don't know. I'm just kind of pulling it out of thin air as we're talking here.
Yeah, I think that culture, trust capital, all that's so closely related, right? And I think communications offices have a bigger impact, a bigger role than they may think at schools in terms of shaping and delivering, reminding, like we are the stories that we tell ourselves as communities, as institutions. And so how we intentionally create a story about ourselves, a narrative saying like, hey, this is what we believe. This is who we are. This is our mission. This is the messy work that we're doing with kids. The more than I think in a situation that stuff's hit the fan or it's gone sideways, that you can be like, yeah, this is all like the work of building community is messy. And sometimes there's going to be really tough situations that come up.
Yeah. And I want to bring it back to kind of more of the, I don't want to say tactical, but more back to like the perspective of the head of school. You had mentioned that you get time with your head, right? Like that's really important to be able to build that trust, that capital. You get time with your board through your advancement committee. You build that trust in the capital. How can a head kind of proactively establish that if maybe that's not in place right now? Like, how do you create those clear lines of communication?
Yeah, I think just establishing and having as a head elevating the, regardless of what the person's title is in terms in the communications office, making sure that there's intentional space for that relationship to grow. And depending on the head of school, it might be an assistant head of school that's going to be messaging out about situations, but whatever it is, like making sure that there is a clear understanding of each person's role, and just carving out, even if it's just 15 minutes a week, 20 minutes every other week, to say, hey, what are the messaging goals? What are you guys doing? I'm talking from the head of school's perspective, asking the communications team, what are the main themes in your alumni magazine this year? What topics are you trying to cover? What are you guys seeing on campus? I think what we see, our team probably sees more of the community in action than any other team on campus. And so there's a two-way information flow also. And so when you can have that, whether it's our team going into classrooms to take photos or video clips or teams or dorms, whatever it is. I'm not sure there's another group on campus that has that kind of window into the experience. And so if you can make sure that information flows two ways, and as a head of school, using that communications team as a resource to say, what are you seeing? Like, what's the vibe in the dorms? Who's doing just an unbelievable job in their classrooms or with their advisories? Because I think we get to see that from a perspective that a lot of other folks in the community don't, because they're in their silo or they're in their little sphere doing really good work.
How would you describe that perspective?
I think, from us, for our perspective, I think we always have that external lens on of saying, like, how is this going to look in a blog post, Instagram post, video? But I think I think our team, like, I think we really understand what our mission is as a school, and we want to celebrate. We want to help the adults and kids in the community celebrate that mission. And so elevating the good that we see, it could be little tiny things. It's like we have that opportunity to shape that culture by elevating certain stories over other stories. And it's not always, for our community, it's not always just the highest performing academic story that you want to tell, right? It's about the growth. It's about the success after a stumble, those kind of stories. And I think that reinforces our messaging, that it's not all perfect, right? No school community is perfect. So don't try to pretend it is. And that, again, back to what we talked about earlier, building that trust capital, building that, that we can tap into when things do get difficult.
Can I ask like a really like in the weeds logistical question?
Sure.
So we both know Brendan Schneider, right? And he's doing this like survey right now on salaries and communications office, marketing offices. What's been fascinating kind of seeing some of the preview data is that the majority of officers are offices of one. And so then you think about what that office is required to do. It's the magazine, the website, social, newsletters, all the things, right? It's just an extraordinarily long list. How do they build the time to think kind of preemptively about crisis, right? When you've got all these things on your plate, should they be prioritizing, some amount of time each quarter to thinking about this, or is this something that is more, look, you got to prioritize time with the stakeholders? I'm curious, or both, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's an either or. I think there's definitely, if you're a team of one, baking into your monthly calendar, at least, just super tactical. Like, are my email lists up to date? Right? If I had to send out a crisis communication right now, are my email lists up to date? Do I have a database that somebody's nurturing, right, to make sure that it's updated with, in case we need to reach out to individuals in time of crisis? I think it has to be a part of the big picture workflow. And I think it's a great conversation to say, who owns this, right? Who owns this in this moment? And to do a little bit like you were saying earlier, how do you run a little bit of a tabletop and say, okay, we get a call that X happened. What's your role as the head of school? What's my role as the communications person? What's the emergency notification? Who's sending out the emergency notification? How do we have backups and redundancies built in? And just having those conversations, because if I'm a team of one and I'm the only person who knows how to hit send on our communication system, right, that's a crisis in and of itself. So how do you, even if you're just a team of one, who are your backups in that? Maybe it's the head of school, maybe it's the assistant head of school, maybe it's the admissions director, right? Whoever it is that there's some existing relationship as a backup.
Having those redundancies in place. Hey, so imagine a scenario. So I'm going to throw a scenario at you, right? So imagine a scenario where, the leadership team is not aligned, right? And you find yourself in crisis. What are like the biggest risks if that alignment is not as strong as it should be once you're going into managing a crisis? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest risk is you lose the trust of the constituents. And I think that is, regardless of what type of crisis it is, that is the biggest institutional risk that you have, because it takes years upon years of of relationship building and consistent experiences to build that trust. And it can be undone in a moment, right? In a single communication if it's not done well. So I think it's a enormous risk. I think, hopefully, even if you don't have great alignment within your leadership team, within the head, the board, my hope would be that you've at least established a culture where you can have that disagreement. And then you can, even if you're not, truly aligned on how you feel it should be, what the response should be, you can at least have that disagreement in the back room. And then when the communication comes out, you're aligned. And I think that's, it's really critical.
Building that high trust team, right? So we've talked a lot about crisis and, ways in which you can be prepared for it, build alignment amongst team, build the relationships, have that trust capital in your culture. But all that work strikes me that it could actually have real benefits long term in non-crisis moments. Like, just that kind of deep alignment, the willingness to, like we just said, be willing to disagree with one another. But when you do arrive at an agreement that everybody stands behind, the high trust environment, like how can a head of school reinforce this in other areas? Like, how do you use it to build greater momentum beyond just responding to something you may not necessarily wake up every day and be like, I want to respond to a crisis, but like, how do you use that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like everything we've talked about, like we've talked about a little bit through the lens of crisis, but schools are operating 95% of the time, hopefully more, not in crisis.
Right.
So it's like there's all these things still apply, all these principles still apply. And if you can have that alignment in your messaging, if you can create really good content that consistently over time reinforces that messaging, reinforces values, that all builds, that's all just good and healthy. I think that concept of trust and a high trust team and having a head of school who models that they're not always going to just get their way. And I think it's a really tricky, as the CEO of an institution, I mean, ultimately it is your call and you want that clear direction. But I think all three, heads that I've had the chance to work with have also in those situations, in different situations, said, I'm going to go with the wisdom of the crowd. Right? Like, here's what I think, but I'm like, you all on the leadership team, admin team, whatever it is, I hear you, and let's go with it. Right. And I think modeling that ability to walk out of that disagreement, that conversation, and having the head of school model that they are aligned with the team and the decision that they may or may not have agreed with goes so far in terms of building that kind of high trust teams.
Yeah. Speaking of, of that, when you're in a crisis, sometimes just the way you position yourself as an individual in terms of your demeanor, in terms of like how you're, absorbing information and processing and then, putting things into action. How can a head balance all the tricky things that come with that? I mean, what's some advice that you would offer?
Yeah, I think, back to that, having the right team around you as the head is really critical. Trusting that as the head, you don't have to be the one to execute every part of whatever plan is in place is critical, and that you can absolutely weigh in. You can have the clear direction, but you have somebody who's really pushing on you to say, hey, here's our strategic priorities. We can't lose focus of this just because we're dealing with this situation over here. Right? How do we keep driving forward? And having that consistent, clear conversation internally to say, hey, Peter, I need you to run on this, and I need you to keep pushing our team forward on this area over here. And John, I need you to do that over here, and Susie over here. And that's, I think, having that delegation as a head of school is absolutely critical, because as you've talked to so many heads in their roles, and like the role is so complex and so complicated and so layered, and you have so many different stakeholders who have immediate access to you, and you're being pulled in all these directions. And so to have somebody who's saying, oh, this is the institutional direction we're driving, and we're going to have these periodic conversations. We're going to structure them into our existence as a leadership team, allows you then as the head to weigh in without feeling like you're driving.
That's such an interesting perspective. I guess it also speaks to your job title, right? As chief strategy officer, like that's actually a title you don't hear too often. I mean, you're starting to see it a little bit more strategy, but I love what you just said there. Hey, I like to end our podcast and offer something that's like super actionable. What is something that folks can do right now? And so if let's imagine a scenario where a head of school calls you and they're looking to build a resilient strategy, communication strategy that aligns with institutional mission and that long-term strategy that you were just talking about. What advice would you offer them?
Yeah, I think the single most important thing is to strip down what your school does to the very basics that set it apart from anybody else. And so understanding, and we went through this exercise a couple years ago, of what are the absolute immovables of a Proctor education. And as we did that discussion as a board and faculty and staff retreat, and we looked, and it was so interesting, not a single program, right? Not a single athletics program or arts program or off-campus program was an immovable. And it was like those cultural underpinnings that saying, like, if this were to change about our school, it would no longer feel like our school to our constituents. And so understanding what those kind of like absolute core things are to your school is the starting point. And then I think we just build on top of that, right? You build an architecture of content and strategy on top of that so that everything comes back to those immovables. And I think if you can message that effectively, you then can layer these features and put each of these features, right, the program, whether it's a ski program or basketball program or arts program.
You can establish the link, right?
You can establish the link, and you can always talk about those through the lens of those immovables. And so for us, it's like, it's not about talking about what we do, right? It's talking about why we do it. And if that's our starting point from a messaging and strategy standpoint, I think that's where you build that trust long term. An alum from the 1960s is not going to have the same experience as an alum from 2014, but they actually might, right? If you talk about it through the lenses of these things that are absolutely core.
Why, not the what, right? I'm curious, are those immovables, did they end up being your school values?
Yeah, I don't know if there's so much our values, but they're
Okay.
definitely like the core of our strategic plan that we have. And I think they'll be the core of our case for support for a future campaign. And it's really stripping it down to what are these, for us, it's all about having a community of diverse learners, right? Of different learning styles. And like, if that were to ever not be a priority and we weren't developing an educational program around that, then we will be going down a direction that doesn't feel aligned.
Right.
Same
I
with
love that.
experiential learning.
So I'm sorry, I know I said last question, but now I'm like, there's like, got a whole bunch in my head here. I'm just curious, how did you go about figuring those things out?
Yeah, it was a lot of conversations. We partnered with Mission and Data as a consulting firm to come in and help facilitate that conversation. And, it was amazing how when you put people in a room to really talk about and frame it that way of like, if X, Y, or Z were not to be a part of the Proctor of the future, would it be the same school?
Right.
And I think it was remarkable. Even people who are deeply tied to specific programs were so easily to say, no, that could go away as long as these core things don't go away. And we've really used that over the last 3 years to structure our messaging, to structure a website redesign, to structure everything. Right? Is that's those core immovables are absolutely essential to everything that we're doing, everything we're building on top of that.
And would the members of your community be able to say what those immovables are?
Yeah, I mean, they genuinely, like, it. I don't know, I've broken up into 7 or 8 different groups, and it was remarkable the consistency of all those groups. If we say, no, you can only have 3 immovables, right? You can only have 3 things. And we had lists of 20, 30 different things, and like, as we broke up into groups and really dug into it, it was remarkable alignment. And I think when you have that strong alignment, when you welcome new people to the community, right, new faculty, new staff, new parents, new students, they get it. Right? I think the challenge that a lot of schools have is that there's not that strength of internal alignment, and that lack of alignment also filters out to constituents, filters out to the community, allows these different factions to arise within the community if you're not centered back on why it is that you exist.
Yeah. I love how those immovables, your why, I'm sure feed heavily into your culture, right? Which has been built over generations. Yeah. All right, Scott, last question, I promise. So if somebody has a question for you, they want to reach out, like what are the best ways for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah, feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn. Feel free, I don't know if you can put my email on the podcast episode. I'm happy to talk, happy to strategize, figure out how each school can be as well positioned as possible, and really do believe like the stronger schools are as a whole, the stronger we all are as an industry, and ultimately like help young people, families to learn and feel good about themselves and be better citizens.
Scott Allenby, Chief Strategy and Communications Officer at Proctor Academy in Andover, New Hampshire. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity, Peter.